I hope you're doing fine. First of all, I want to thank you for attending this because I know there are parallel tracks and they also looked very promising. I also want to say congrats to everybody who participated in making this event possible. I think it's truly inspiring since in my city we did not have a WordCamp, so it's great to see when there's a new one popping up. My name is Robert Mészáros. Mészáros means butcher in English. And as you can see, this is about data anonymization. To set a bit of expectations up, so what you will hear, besides what she introduced, it is divided in two parts. The first part being a very high-level overview, so we kind of like get on the same page with the general ideas, what tools exist, what the process entails, why it's important. The second part is kind of like a collection of things that I thought are important to keep in mind, consider. It's kind of like to navigate this process if somebody wants to just get started with. And I would say the second part is a bit fast-paced and has more technical jargon, so that's a bit more dev-oriented. And at the end, there's of course like a Q&A where I'm happy to answer questions, and if I know the answers, if not, I will follow up with you. And before I start, just a minute about the terminology used here. I use the term anonymization in the title, and so far, what from going on, I will try to avoid using that. And the reason is simple. We could understand different things by it if you use it in an informal setting or if you use it in a data protection law context. And actually, it also matters what kind of data protection law we are talking about, because really the nuanced differences have an impact. So I thought instead of spending quite a lot of time to introduce like a bunch of terms which are related and needed to be explained, I will use a bit more less loaded terms that are more general. And one of that would be sensitive data. So this is practically any data which could be considered as such from different perspectives. So this could mean data which is the concern of data protection laws like addresses, credit cards, numbers, and so on. But on a different perspective, it could mean also like tokens, keys stored in the database, because it happens that they are stored there. And from a business perspective, there could be also data, financial data, which might be worth protecting and not somehow leaking to the competition. And by cleanup, I just mean the various techniques and the process to actually deal with this sensitive data in some kind of form or another. So with this being out of the way, let's get started. I just want to give some ideas when this matters. Of course, this is not like an exhausting list, it's just various collections. One which I think is pretty relatable when a developer is hired to fix one specific thing. And to be more concrete, let's take an e-commerce website and the problem is some kind of visual issue on the front end. The developer might require the database to set the website up locally, and in that case, the data, for example, about the orders, the addresses in the orders are shared with them, which should not happen. And the most important thing is that the developer also doesn't need that data to fix that specific problem. A bit more diverse case if there's an e-commerce which has been existing for many years, maybe like a third party is hired to do some kind of financial analysis, and they might use a business intelligence tool. So these tools could be connected directly to the same database that WordPress users use. And in this case, again, same problem might appear. This analysis might need the orders data in general, but they don't need, for example, the addresses of people. Similar example, which is very 2025, where the system or the database is connected to some kind of AI or RAG integration. Again, we might think that these services protect us, but by using some kind of prompt injection or some kind of various techniques, we can make these LLMs to behave in very different ways that they are intended to. So why would somebody care? First of all, they might just think doing this is important because they think it's part of having high professional standards, and in some cases actually is the bare minimum for some kind of companies to have these processes. On the other hand, avoiding penalties is also a good reason to care about this. Pretty much all countries have some kind of data protection law, even if they are enforced very differently. Nevertheless, the fines might be very high, and they are getting stricter and stricter. From a business perspective, it could be also like a competitive advantage. Having these processes, somebody knowing this could offer really an advantage, especially if they are working with certain clients, or they might be actually like a filtering for the client. They only look for some kind of people who know these kinds of things. So what does the process look like? So if you're just taking a high-level overview, what are the critical steps? First is like an identification. So we have to know, we have to have an inventory of all data which is stored, especially about the sensitive ones. And from a technical perspective, we actually have to know where those are stored. Since we are talking about WordPress, and if you just take the vanilla WordPress installation, it's pretty clear what kind of data is stored there. That is well documented, it's well known. There are some data stored related to users. There are some IP addresses stored in the comments table, but this is very easy to find out. When it comes to plugins, things get a bit more complicated, but with well-known plugins, e-commerce plugins, form plugins, again, pretty easy to find out. Lots of people know about this. It is documented. But when it comes to bespoke, custom, or niche plugins, we really have to sometimes dig into code, or we have to chase people to find out this information so they provide an actual documentation. Because data could be stored in some custom tables, they could be stored in the post meta table, or even in the option table. The next step is actually performing some kind of cleanup, and this could be various techniques. So this could mean deleting the data. So if you're thinking back at the e-commerce example, with somebody fixing a visual issue, we could just simply delete the orders data before handing over the database, because they just simply do not need it, and probably this is the safest option. Another option is to have some selective removal. So we keep, let's say, the orders, but we just remove whatever we consider sensitive. Another, which is pretty common, is using masking, where we are trying to hide the data, or at least partially, and replacing with some kind of tokens. But probably a better option is altogether use a substitution. So this could mean replacing with some kind of static placeholders, or we could also just generate data which fits the purpose. In this case, it's just like random names. Another example would be noise addition, where we take the original value as the root and we try shifting that value between certain boundaries to maintain its statistical usefulness. In this case, it might be important to keep it, but we still want to decrease the chance of somebody being identified through indirect identifiers such as the age. Different one, and this is the last example, is where we use generalization. So we replace one value with a more general concept, let's say the country with a region, and here we are actually changing the data which is stored. So we had country, we have now regions, but this could be fine in cases where the data is eventually shared with a third party, let's say with a business intelligence tool, so not with WordPress, the application. And of course, depending on the use case, there are many, many more techniques, more advanced and more simple ones. I also want to highlight the verification step because it's often overlooked. If somebody is using some kind of manual process, the documentation might be simply outdated. If they are using some kind of automation process, the process might fail, or it might just partially fail. So we really have to bake into some kind of verification at the end to make sure if the process was successful. And we can come back to this a bit later, how that might look like. So how would somebody do these kinds of things? In a WordPress context, of course, there's a plugin for everything, and there are add-ons to plugins. For example, if somebody is using already some kind of migration plugin, there might be add-ons to that, so they can just plug it into their workflow and piggyback on the existing plugins. But there are also like standalone plugins made just for this specific purpose. And of course, these are just examples to demonstrate the category. You can find many more. So these standalone plugins typically offer a UI interface where you can select the table, you can select the column, select the type of transformation that you want, and practically build up the rule set that you want to run eventually. There are, of course, WordPress CLI packages if somebody prefers to use those. But I think the more interesting ones are the ones which are WordPress agnostic. So these tools are not made specific to WordPress. They do not care if the application is WordPress, is that Laravel, Symfony, any custom ones. And if somebody finds a good tool to make it use, they can use across any kind of projects. And these typically offer a configuration. So it's very much like with the UI plugin, where somebody can define the table, can define the columns, the transformation, and practically they can use the tool to process this. And of course, sometimes a simple bash script with SQL statements could do the job. There are desktop softwares that offer very advanced features like RX. There are enterprise solutions which are more tuned to healthcare system. They offer features like generating synthetic data and so on. And there's also alternative approaches of thinking about this. So instead of exporting a database file, somehow cleaning that up and then handing it over, we could have proxies in front of the MySQL database and doing transformation of data on the fly if somebody connects through those. And many, many more, but I think there's really something for anybody to get started with. And I also want to highlight that there's something already built into the WordPress core. This is really specific to the users, and there's some functionality that allows the substitution of the email addresses, the names, and so on. This was introduced in the 4.9.6 version and practically didn't receive too many updates since then. But from a dev perspective, I think it's interesting to look at it, what exists, and somehow how to use it maybe in creative ways, or even contribute to WordPress to make it a bit more robust. And with this, we arrive to the second part, the guidepost. So first of all, basic safety rules apply. You should not forget to do backups. Don't do it directly on production. If you are moving files around, you should do it in a very secure way, or maybe even encrypt that. The use case is very important. So if we think back at the examples I gave, handing over the database to a developer to do a front-end fix, we can drop the orders altogether. In a different use case, we have to maintain that data. So practically, we should start at the end, look at the situation, what we want to achieve, and kind of like work backwards. And sometimes multiple use cases could exist, and multiple processes might exist. And I think that's an okay thing. We don't have to find a solution that fits every use case. If somebody doesn't know where to start, once they did the inventory, they can use some kind of priority metrics where they take into account the risk and impact. Let's say leaking the physical addresses of people, I would say that's high risk, high impact, maybe comparing to the email addresses, which are also worthy of protecting, but that's typically also public information. And we should plan for maintenance. If it's an active project, we have to take into account that the database might change, we might install plugins. We somehow have to have a process to go back and evaluate and start it again. Do the identification if something is installed, set up the cleanup processes, and so on. And this is why documentation is so critical. And at bare minimum, the documentation should contain the inventory, like inventory of all sensitive data, exactly where those are stored, why it is important, because with time things might change and they might not be critical anymore. What kind of transformation should exist based on the use case, and more importantly, the verification step. How would somebody determine that the cleanup was successful? And of course, besides this could include the exact steps, who should do it, in what kind of frequency, and so on. When it comes to picking tools, hosting is an important factor because this could also limit the options. To give a trivial example, if the hosting doesn't offer to connect to the database remotely, if somebody wants to set up a complex pipeline of cleanup, it's just simply not possible. On the other hand, hosting could offer interesting options. For example, if a hosting offers a tool to copy the database from an environment to another, maybe there's a way to hook into that process and do the cleanup while using or piggybacking on the tools offered by the hosting themselves. It's also worth looking beyond WordPress, because really any application that stores data, even if it stores it in database or some kind of other form, they might have simply sensitive data, and there are solutions out there. So we should look what exists, and we could also go a bit more extreme, look at solutions which are outside of our comfort zone, or even different programming languages. Because if we are dealing with very large amounts of data, some kind of CLI which is written in low-level languages might be more suitable. It's also worth keeping a bit in mind what some WordPress specifics. To give two examples, one would be the multi-site network scenario, because in those cases, the tables themselves contain dynamic data, which are the IDs of the site. So if the tool doesn't offer a way to target these tables with a placeholder, then we have to configure practically the tables with every site. So just by saying site 1 post, site 2 post, and so on. Another complexity could be, it's kind of like the assumption that some tool make, that the data is stored very neatly and in a very normalized way in the database. And sometimes that's not the case with WordPress. Sometimes very complex data structures are stored. Just give an example. The options of a plugin might be stored in one place in like a very nested array. If that nested array contains the token, then the tool somehow should support just targeting that specific key in the database. Otherwise, the tool is not usable maybe for us. So it's also worth looking for tools which are extendable even. Application level, when we are selecting the transformation, we should not just focus on the database. To make it very concrete, if the phone number is stored as a varchar, we could practically replace with a static placeholder. From a database perspective, that is perfectly suitable. But at the application level, if somebody is trying to use that cleanup database, they might run into problems because we might have some certain validations in our code that would make it fail. Again, let's not forget about the verification step, how this might look like. If we have end-to-end tests, and those end-to-end tests typically also require a database, those should be run and we should have those. We should also do some kind of manual exploration, so look at the database once it has been cleaned up, because that's pretty much the only way we could catch if we forget to clean up certain data. But we could also use automation. We could also, for example, for the deletion, we can make a query and just check if nothing is returned back. Or for a substitution, we can look if that placeholder, if only that placeholder exists in a specific table cell, and so on. And while I try to avoid legalities in this talk, they shouldn't be ignored. So somebody should actually make the due diligence to read these, because they might also have an impact on the processes which are implemented. To give an example, sometimes it is regulated that the data shouldn't leave some kind of geographical boundary, or they might not even leave a specific data center. So again, these impact the processes. And when it comes especially to legalities, we should consult a specialist. If a developer implements this, they are not a lawyer. And really, sometimes the interpretation of the laws should be left to people who are more capable than us. And while I focused on specifically on the database, to have like a full system, we should consider all the data that is stored. So this could mean also what is stored in the file system, because sometimes the uploads folder might be also shared, and that could contain sensitive data. Let's say somebody is collecting CVs through some kind of form. That definitely contains sensitive data. And we should also do not downplay the complexity of this. We can reach pretty far ahead with certain plugins, but after a point, we really need some kind of specialized knowledge. But this is thing that could be learned. And to kind of like be a bit more down to earth when it comes to certain workflows, I just come up with certain examples. Let's say somebody has a production environment and they also have a staging environment. They might use the synchronization that the hosting offers. So practically moving the data from one environment is handled by the hosting. They could install a plugin, and practically with the plugin, they could create the rule set and clean up the staging environment. And from that point, typically the hosting, if it offers the synchronization, it also offers a way to create a dump, and we can share that to the developer. This is, of course, a very high-level overview. Many things have to be worked out, like what happens between the time the synchronization happens and the cleanup is run. There's some kind of time frame when sensitive data might be there. How should we protect that? Who should have access there? But high level, this could be one workflow. Another case where we again have a production and we have like an intermediary environment. And in this case, this could be like a CI pipeline, let's say a GitHub action. The GitHub action could connect to the production environment, create the export, handle the cleanup automatically, and could save potentially the cleanup version as an artifact, where then developers can access that, but only the cleanup version. Again, many details are missing. Who triggers this? Is that synchronized? What is the data retention once the export was moved there? But this is a possible workflow. And this is the last one. Again, we might have a CI, but instead of saving the output of the cleaned up database, it's actually moving to a staging environment. So practically, we do not have this synchronization offered by a hosting, but we do that ourselves. And here in this scenario, somebody, maybe like a business, somebody using a business intelligence tool might gain access to the staging, and they can connect their tool to an environment which is already cleaned up. And of course, there are endless variation of workflows, and you should come up with whatever suits your solution and use case. And I just want to give two recommendations. One is a book. It's called Building an Anonymization Pipeline. It's a very comprehensive book. very detailed and technical, but it's quite readable. So if somebody likes to go deep, I would recommend this. Another one is just a PDF. It contains maximum 10 pages. It's called 10 Misunderstandings Related to Anonymization. It's from a governmental department from the European Union. It's kind of like a pamphlet where somebody can easily read. And I think it's very enlightening to see what we understand colloquially by data anonymization versus what it means when we are talking in the context of data protection laws. And with this, I'm happy to answer any questions.